Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Ferrari have looked into just what caused their latest mishap of the season with Charles Leclerc's terrible qualifying at the Spanish Grand Prix. They say though there was no problem with the car and it was actually more likely an operational problem with one of the engineers making a serious blunder. What does this mean for the future? Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, the Canadian Grand Prix is coming up this weekend. F1 23 is actually now out as well and there's been lots of debate, as there always is, on the driver ratings. These are how the drivers were rated in the game. We'll look at all 20 in a second. These are the top 10. Max Verstappen stays at a 94, so they evaluate them across their experience, their racecraft, their awareness, and their pace. And I think the highest awareness is actually Valtteri Bottas, who gets a 97 for some reason. Anyway, Verstappen's a 94 rated overall. Alonso and Hamilton are tied at a 92 rating. Then it goes down to Charles Leclerc at 89. Norris, Perez, maybe surprisingly high, we'll get into that. Sainz, Russell, Bottas, Ocon, that's your top 10. Bottas maybe, they get carried a little bit by how long they've been in the sport. The likes of Piastri, for example, I think gets kind of hard done by. But anyway, here you go, and you can see the numbers here. So this is experience, racecraft, awareness, pace, etc, etc. Kind of like one lap pace, I guess, is the idea here. But Leclerc maybe slightly lower there than you think he is. Maybe it's not just, probably just pace overall, to be fair. But it's interesting that Perez has like 93 racecraft. I feel like that's a little bit ambitious, to be honest. And then we get down to Stroll, who has 91 racecraft. I don't know where they're getting that from, but it is what it is. He gets an 84 overall. Tsunoda's up at an 83. Zhou did pretty well to get to 78. I feel like Piastri, as I say, is getting a little bit hard done by with a 74 rating, but that's what they've decided to do. And there you go. Speaking of Hamilton, Toto Wolff has actually given his latest thoughts on the contract situation and says it's going to be happening very soon. We believe that one day after the Spanish Grand Prix, just over a week ago today, they had a conversation and you'd imagine they got a little bit closer to a resolution. As Toto Wolff says, we are talking more days than weeks to get this done. It's going to happen soon. We're trying hard to get it done before Canada. I will see him today and maybe we will talk about it. So they're going to get it signed. It's going to happen at some point. I don't know when. He says more days than weeks, so that kind of implies maybe next week after the Canadian Grand Prix. Who knows? I doubt they're going to get it absolutely finalised in the next couple of days. They might. There's money involved. It always gets a bit tricky. Lewis is the most important personality in the sport. He is so multifaceted, not only with the racing, but also off track. So we need to keep him in the sport for as long as possible, he says. And they are probably helping that by at least upgrading their car to some extent over the last couple of races. That's the latest on the Hamilton contract situation. And one more quick thing on Mercedes, actually. McLaren have implied they will be looking to extend their relationship with Mercedes high-performance powertrains, as they are technically called, that have been using for a couple of years now. Team Principal Andrea Stella says there is no relationship with Red Bull Ford. There was a rumour going around that McLaren might partner with the Red Bull Ford project, but I think Horner said that their plan for the first couple of years will just be to supply Red Bull and Alfa Tauri so they don't overstretch themselves too much. And we know that Honda have said that their Aston Martin deal is a works relationship, i.e. they will be the sole partner there. So for McLaren, they couldn't get the Honda deal. Maybe they wouldn't want it, but they couldn't get it. They couldn't get the Ford deal. They ran out of options. Porsche decided to pull out and all of these things. So maybe they're being forced into continuing their Mercedes contract. They probably don't mind doing it, but still, if you really want to compete, and this is the thing that Stroll has, this is Lawrence Stroll and Aston Martin, if you want to be the top dog, you probably need to be your own engine supplier or have an engine supplier that is just yours, as has been the case for Red Bull the last few years with Honda, and is now going to be the case with Aston Martin. So that's a quick update on what McLaren are going to be up to. And of course, Ferrari got some good news a couple of days ago. Victory at the 24-hour of Le Mans, can you believe it? Obviously a very different challenge to winning in Formula 1. And there's other mitigating circumstances, the balance of power, weird things they've got going on there over in the world endurance racing side of things. But one of the key talking points back in Spain was the new side pods they brought to the car, the new upgrades that they called them. Whether they actually make the car any better, that's something that Ferrari often struggle with their upgrades, but nonetheless they believe their package now has more potential. Yes, it was the same old story for Ferrari. Solid enough in qualifying, but not spectacular. Their car was actually probably the worst of anyone through that final corner, that final high speed, nearly flat out or flat out for some teams. I think even Stroll was the only man to do it flat out in qualifying. qualifying. But the Ferrari wasn't particularly good there, but still, they reckon on different circuits they're going to be more competitive. The problem they run into, though, the big one of the weekends, was Leclerc's terrible qualifying. Goes out in Q1, was nowhere near the pace, despite, I'm pretty sure, sticking it on pole there last year, right? So what happened to Leclerc in qualifying? There's been lots of analysis here. This is from Madi Racing, M-A-D-I Racing on YouTube, analysing the comparison between Leclerc on the left and Carlos Sainz on the right-hand side, their qualifying laps. And as was known at the time, the left-hand corners were a disaster for Leclerc's Ferrari. They don't seem to, well, they didn't know why at the time. Leclerc didn't know why at the time, and they've spent the last week or so analysing what's happened here. We can see this left-hand turn, like Leclerc's actually having to dab the brakes here. The brake kind of analysis on the telemetry is always a bit off, because if they even slightly touch the brake, it pretends that it's been fully applied. I think that's probably because all the teams have different pressure setups, so they can't really reveal all that information. But you can see that he's have to dab the brakes here, and which is surprising anyway for this corner, and he's lifted off more than Sainz has. And then a couple of corners later, we get him missing the apex by a mile here at turn 5, which is, you know, you wouldn't expect Leclerc to do this given he's pretty damn good at qualifying, and he got poled there the previous season, right? So what happened? Leclerc said after the fact, he was like, I knew I was out, the car was terrible, it was undrivable in the left-hand corners, there was something off which we need to analyse and understand, it was very weird behaviour. Just this morning, the feeling was very good with the car, so he was confident, and then it all fell away. Sainz got P2, ended up, what, P5 in the race, and Leclerc couldn't even recover to the points after starting from the pit lane with poor race pace again, and frankly, poor strategy from Ferrari. As they go on to say, the data at the time showed that every left-hand corner he was losing roughly 0.2 of a second. So it could have been, and that's what they thought at the time, there were some suspect parts on the car. They pretty much stripped the entire car apart, put it back together again, changed the setup to go back to what they might have been using before, just did it all from scratch. That meant he had to start from the pit lane, and he ended up having a decent race, but wasn't even good enough for points. Having done the research into this at Maranello over the last couple of weeks, they've investigated the phenomenon and found that there were no issues with the car. The parts weren't broken, there was no issue with anything in terms of the actual pieces of carbon fibre in that machinery. The issue is more than likely setup related, and I'm not sure if that's actually better or worse. So there's a discussion here in the article about the fact that they are confident that the SF23, despite having failed many of the targets for it, is better now than it was before. Circuits like Canada that might suit them, more like stop-start circuits, more rear limited, that should favour them marginally more than it favours the Mercedes, and possibly the Aston, we'll see, but it's the race pace that's really let them down, right? They've been competitive in qualifying from the start of the season. They're only a couple of tenths off in Bahrain, but in race pace, nowhere near, of course, and Red Bull are dominating. This is the piece, though, that's interesting, is that there were no physical breakdowns or malfunctions that they could find. They analysed Leclerc's car, they were like, what went wrong in qualifying, and nothing seemed to be wrong, which I guess is good, but it's like, well, if nothing was wrong, what caused him to have the terrible qualifying result, and is the car just entirely unpredictable? So it seems like some sort of setting, as in the setup side of the story, that's where things went wrong. So either some engineer just made a massive mistake, messed something up on the setup going into qualifying, or the engineering team just made a mistake, and maybe it happens, your first race with this new concept, it's possible that you're going to make some errors there, but it's a pretty big error. It cost Leclerc's qualifying entirely. He would have been, you know, Sainz got P2. You'd have thought Leclerc could have put it P2 if he'd have been up there in the conversation. Not the case, though. Ruined his weekend, but then it raises the question about the Ferrari operations, as we have seen again for the last couple of years. Last year, fundamentally, it was the reliability that cost them the chance to fight for the title, but secondarily was operations and strategy, right? So the kind of stuff that happens in the garage itself. We know Ferrari's been dodgy with this for years, and the idea that they messed up his setup going into qualifying just before Parc Ferme, and therefore they had to break Parc Ferme, right, and start from the pit lane as a result of this error, is pretty terrible from Ferrari again. Other teams don't really do this stuff. I don't really remember a time in recent memory where a car is looking pretty good all weekends. They go into quali, someone's made a massive mistake, and the car is undrivable in left-hand corners, and it ruins a guy's weekend. Doesn't usually happen, but if it's going to happen to a team, it's going to happen to Ferrari, right? So in theory, you'd think, okay, they'll learn from this, and they'll make sure they don't do it again in the future, but with Ferrari, they always manage to invent new ways to make mistakes, to mess things up, and to find find themselves not getting any points, or not as many as they should. So I'm sure they've got another trick up their sleeve come Canada, and we might not see this issue again, but we might see other issues again. So that's just what Ferrari are playing at lately. Another bit of a disaster class in them, it's got to be said. And yeah, Leclerc has less points, I think, now than he did have in 2020, where their car was like the worst car that Ferrari had made in 40 or so years or something. Quick note on Matteo Binotto, formerly of Ferrari. There have been some rumours where he's going to go next. Audi actually have said that there is no validity to rumours that he might well be joining them, so that's kind of interesting. There's also been some discussion that Alpine want him to replace Otmar as their head guy. So nobody really seems to know where he's going to go next. I still think he could be valuable at Ferrari, but obviously they don't want him as the team principal, and he probably wants another job of that ilk in some other team going forward. And just to close out the video, I thought this was kind of interesting. Of course, reliability and other issues like Stroll, for example. Okay, Stroll's had some stinky races, but he did also have a reliability issue back in Jeddah. George Russell, of course, also had that reliability problem back in Australia. But the only three drivers, the top three rated, actually kind of interesting on the F1 game, are that have scored points every single round. Verstappen, of course, Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. So who's going to keep the streak the longest? You'd think probably Verstappen, but who really knows, right? Reliability is going to come knocking for some of these drivers at some points, you would think. Mercedes, generally pretty good at reliability, but to be honest, so are Red Bull as it stands at the moment. So very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.